So how old were you when you first did get to romance?
So this is going to be like really surprising to people because I feel like a lot of romance authors were like, I started reading it at like 11 or something. But I grew up in a place where like you were not likely to like go to, especially at the time, you couldn't go to a bookstore and see like all the romance novels on the shelf. So, and like my mom didn't have any either. And so I would like read other books and I would always like cling to whatever like tiny thread of romance there was in them, even if it was not the main
Yeah.
plot. So it was definitely always like love romance. By the time I actually, so two things happened. One, once at the bookstore, something slipped through, and I think and it was historical romance, and I think it was because the cover was just like a woman in this pretty dress, and so whoever was buying the books for the store was like, what could possibly be in here? Anyway, there was a lot in there because I bought it. They had shelved it with Shakespeare. I'm like a big Shakespeare person, so I had been like I was like in that aisle, and I was like, this is not Shakespeare. It was actually historical romance anthology. So certain things did slip through. I had read a couple of contemporaries. Meg Cabot had this like epistolary series back in like the 2000s. And so I would read those, but they were all very like fade to black. And honestly, reading them, I was like, do people live like this? Like, I know that sounds insane, but also we have to understand like where I was growing up and how sheltered I was, or I was like, is is that like I knew it was real, but at the same time I was like, is that a thing? Like, I don't know. So when I bought that anthology of historical romance and oh my God, I like started reading it and I remember I had started reading it like on a Friday and then Saturday I stayed until bed until 4 p.m. because I couldn't stop reading it. It definitely drew me in more than any other contemporary one had. And I think it's because I don't know, historical heroines felt like me a little bit. I know what it's like to be in a community where you're always being watched, maybe potentially judged. Like there's that lack of freedom a little bit. And I just want to, I also should say, like, that was my experience. I also do not consider myself as having been like oppressed. I have to say that as an Arab person, because sometimes people will hear me say these things and be like, oh, all of our stereotypes about the Middle East are right. We're just very sheltered, right? I had a lot of
Mhm.
freedoms. I just didn't have access to romance novels, right?
Sure.
So yeah, and so I read it and it was I to this day I can't find it. I legitimately want to find this so bad. It had like a purple cover. I remember only one story because it had a scarred hero, and I was like, I can get into this. Plot twist still into that, obviously. I was like, oh, half his face is burnt off. Like, oh my God, like if only someone would love him. So yeah, I was just like obsessed with that. And then later, a family friend visited actually from the States, and she left like a Debbie Maycomer book in
Mm.
our apartment. And so it just found its way onto the shelf. And one day I was like, what is this? I'm gonna read it. And that was probably like my first full length romance novel that actually had like sex on the page and it was like a romance set on a ranch, so like very far from like historical, but it was still like so fascinating for me to read because I just hadn't read stories like that. I was probably about 16 at the time, which is like late for people to come to romance, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I also was a late to life romance reader. I really didn't get into it until my 20s, but I did read Meg Cabot a lot in high school.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of the like Boy Meets Girl series?
Yes, that's exactly the one.
I still have my copies of that. I used to just read it over and over and over again. And I like every 3 years or so, I'm like, it's time for a reread.
Because they're so fun. I had never read like an epistolary novel either, and I know that you just wrote one as well, right? And like
Yes,
yours is like
and
letters.
those were like baked in as I was writing this. I was like, I'm living my Meg Cabot dreams.
I was actually wondering that because I know it's like letters and like menus and like all these little tidbits. I was like, listen, this is very my cabin boy meets girl series.
Yes.
Yeah, those were the ones that I had been reading as a teenager, and I read like obviously the Princess Diaries and also her Mediator series, which
Oh
I
my God, I
really
loved the Mediator
love
series.
Mediator. So I definitely had like a little bit of romance, but if we're talking about like the romance novel, it's like, there's sex on the page and the romance is the main plot. was probably a little later than
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah. That's interesting. When I was in high school, my family lived in Poland.
Mhm.
And in terms of English language books, there weren't that many available. There was like the American bookstore, which had what you might find in an airport. And then there was the
Mhm.
school library, which definitely didn't have romance books. And as far as I can remember, the American bookstore really didn't either. And so, very different circumstances from you, but still, I also just kind of like didn't have access to the books that I
Yeah.
would have been drawn to.
Yeah, and like honestly, it's strange because in retrospect, I was like, I don't think it's safe necessarily to not have access to romance novels because if you're living in any kind of like conservative society where nobody really talks to you about anything, right? Sometimes books are the only place that you can learn things. And if someone is going to learn about relationships and sex, I would prefer if they did it through romance novels, potentially.
Right.
Like, you know, like obviously early on we had romance novels where there was a lot of dubious consent, but then as we moved away from it, you have like really good framework for what relationships can look like, right? Healthy ones. And so and sometimes I think to myself, like, I don't think that's safe to not even have access to that, right?
Right. Even when romance novels are not didactic or are not, not that realistic, they still are saying, hey, when you have a romantic relationship, it can be important to you and it can also be very positive in your life and you can be partners. And so it's not necessarily that people are like, oh, I'm going to read this romance novel so I know how to have sex, but I'm going to read this romance novel so I know how I might want to feel about having sex.
Exactly. And I think that's like the fear some people have where they're like, oh my God, if my child reads a romance novel, they're gonna be right out the door. I'm like, first of all, no, like I wouldn't have not left my room for anything. And I'm still like that.
Yeah.
Like, no, I don't think readers are the type to like want to exit the comfort of their room to go into the world. But yeah, I think that's the fear. But it's like if I strip everything away from romance novels, it's like, hey, it's okay that you want to be emotionally fulfilled and also physically fulfilled if that's what you like as well. Like that's all they're telling us, right? Because you get a lot of pushback too, where it's like, it's so unrealistic. I'm like, not when I strip it down to bare bones. I don't think I'm going to be whisked away by like some duke with like a scar on his face. I mean, I would love it at this point in my life. Like I say that out of sheer exhaustion, like just like being alive. But that's not what like we're taking from it, right? And that's not the expectation it's setting.
Yes. Yeah, I agree completely. And also, I think actually, if you give kids, teenagers access to romance novels, they might be satisfied by the romance novel and not feel the need to go out and have those experiences themselves yet. At least that was the kind of kid I was.
Yeah,
So,
I did not feel any need to do anything, honestly. I was very like I mean, I think we discount like how much it like feeds creativity and maybe makes somebody want to like write and express themselves. So there's so much good that can come out of it. And I honestly don't think there's any bad that can come out of reading a book in general. So
yeah.
I think it's good to like make them available and let people have access to them.